So we now have 40 minutes to talk about the sovereignty of Europe, and we were given two main topics. Now, I don't know how you felt, but I actually felt that we just left the comfort zone of the Social Democrats. The federal minister is talking about deterrence, and the party chairman is talking about a German leadership role. And you also asked for some criticism or countering arguments, and we will start right away. One play in advance, we would like to incorporate your online comments, so please use the two hashtags TJK22 and Zeitenwende, and I would like to briefly incorporate your statements before the end of the panel. Jana Puglierin, I would like to start with you. So what was striking from your point of view with regard to the speech, or what was missing when it comes to strengthening Europe and to come together and to take away bureaucracy? So where could you start? Thank you very much. I would like to mention three different aspects. One is a major compliment to Lars Klingbeil and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Both have become the spear tip, so to speak, of a further debate on the Zeitenwende and a discussion on what Zeitenwende means. And so they filled a gap that think tanks like my own have seen over the past months. There was too little input from the political side, too little further thinking and further ideas, but this was really a great start today. And this is great. I really enjoy that. And the second aspect, I will start with commending you as well, but then I will go further. I think your self-criticism was great as well, and I have heard it from time to time over the past months from the Social Democrats, but I personally found it very impressive, especially with regard to Russia, that you said we were wrong, we didn't see certain developments, and you also asked why was this the case, and you also said that after 2014 we should have reacted differently and should have developed a different attitude here. So this is great, and there's no way back to the status quo ante. Now I'm coming to some criticism, or maybe this means that I'm just going beyond to what we should do in the future. What I was missing is what then? What next? In particular with regard to Russia. I know it's very difficult when it comes to Russia, where we do not know where we will end up, also in terms of the war. But the question now is, should we organize European security against Russia? This would actually be the consequence when you say that we take the Baltic states seriously, for example. So how should we deal with Ukraine, with Georgia, apart from the candidate status and the post-Soviet sphere? Because the question is, how will security be organized there? How will be our commitment there? So this is what I was missing. I was missing more fighter for a new social democratic Eastern policy, in particular to the countries of Eastern Europe. And I mean, you mentioned we need closer cooperation, and you also said that we have neglected these countries in the past, but I would have liked to hear more about the future. What are we going to do now? And the third aspect is I really appreciated your insight that Germany needs to be a leading power. I think that other countries have been long expecting it, especially after the Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. Germany was expected to become a leading power in the West, or at least within Europe. I think one difficulty here is that many people in Europe, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the northern part of Europe, have the impression that this leadership role that is attributed to us is not being fulfilled by Germany, especially in this war, as many would like to see. And of course, we don't have to do what Poland or the Baltic states want us to do, but I think it's we have to make sure that we do not see a division between Central and Northern Europe and the East and Western part of Europe. So if we want to assume a leadership role, then we have to make sure that Europe is not divided, is not falling apart. We have to communicate our own intentions better. Where do we stand? What do we want? We have to incorporate our partners into our decision-making processes. We have to accept the problem analyses of others, and we should also make sure that we do not have a hidden agenda. Thank you very much, Jana.
Und damit wir so ein bisschen Wechselspiel bekommen.
And in order to have an interchange between criticism and also approval. I would like to go over to Katarina Barley. As the Vice President of the European Parliament, you have seen this personally. So, in how far has time come? Natalie Tocci talked about the institutions that emerged after the Second World War and that they now undergo a certain change. And the EU initially was meant to incorporate Germany so that Germany would never, ever again go it alone. So how can we turn this leadership demand into practice despite these institutions? Well, this is not a contradiction. I think one is dependent on the other. And I think it's quite good that Germany so far has made sure that it is not assuming this leadership. This was wise in the past, and most initiatives that we've seen, also most recently, the COVID support package, I mean, this was actually a seizure. Caesura. So we could make more debts in order to get over or solve the impact of this crisis. And the role of Germany is actually changing because Germany is changing, the reunified Germany, of course. And more time passes. We are now discussing our relationship with Russia in a completely different way than several decades ago. But Europe and the world is changing as well. We have an important membership that we lost due to the Brexit, and the United Kingdom also had a leadership role in some areas, for example, when it comes to security and defense policy. So they were usually leading in this sphere. And France, due to the elections, we are faced with a very difficult situation at the moment, which weakens Emmanuel Macron. He no longer has an absolute majority and has to form a government with difficult partners, coalition partners. And yes, Germany sees it and feels this. And the Zeitenwende speech from Olaf Scholz had a huge impact. We could feel that. This, I mean, the term is already coined, but this actually, I mean, had a real impact on the European Parliament, and people were relieved, I would like to put it like that, relieved, and they also recognize it, that we have embarked on this very difficult path. They also acknowledge how difficult it is for Germany, and they acknowledge the kind of importance, this Zeitenwende, which is also a turning point, has how much effort we have to put into it, and how much effort within the party, but also within society, we have to put into it. This was really appreciated in the European Parliament. And I have to add, when it comes to the practical sides, of course, there are wave-like situations, wave-like developments. I don't want to go into individual positions, but sometimes one or the other asks, why isn't he doing more, or why aren't you communicating it better? But usually, even though there is some criticism in terms of individual measures or a lack of individual measures, usually it's a huge recognition that Germany is embarking on this path, this major change. Because this discussion about defense and joint defense policy has clearly changed due to the speech. Thank you very much. Just a follow-up question. This initiative, also in terms of the accession perspective for Ukraine and Moldova and also the Western Balkans, is this already part of a German leadership role for geopolitical strengthening of the EU? Yes, this is the case, but we also have to say that Olaf Scholz did deliberately not travel alone to Kiev, and he did not only travel with the French and the Italian heads of state and government, but there was also a Romanian participating here, and sometimes this was missed out in the media. I'm not sure who said it earlier, but in the European Union, currently, we are faced with a huge risk that a narrative develops that there is some kind of East against West, the Polish and the Hungarian government are fostering this, but we have to make sure that this narrative does not develop, because this is simply not the case. I mean, of course, we are not cooperating equally well with everyone, and of course, there are some differences in opinion, but this was a joint visit which immediately has shown some effect. So the Dutch government was initially against it, and also others, but yesterday I had a breakfast with a Dutch politician, and she said, well, this is no longer an issue. I mean, when these four countries visit Kiev and say Ukraine should be given the candidate status, then, of course, that's the way it is. Claudia, the minister, also pointed to the relationship EU-NATO. So for some time, there was this strategic autonomy because some didn't like it because they thought, well, we are trying to get independent of the US. But we also saw that deterrence by ourselves is not yet possible. So do we still lack the trust into Germany in the field of security and defense policy? Katarina Barley talked about UK, which was in the lead in this regard. Does this apply to Germany? And if so, how can we change it? Thank you very much. I would like to go one step back, because when we talk about the EU-NATO cooperation, I think it's very important to try to think about the framework in which we organize security and defense policy. Natalie Tocci has talked about it. She said the old order has disappeared and we do not know what is coming up next. And this is right. Lars Klingbeil said we are in some interim stage between the old and the new order. I do not know what will come next. This is actually the $1 million question, but I think that we can, or we already have some ideas. I mean, one certainly is, and we already heard about that this morning, is that the old idea, which was quite popular in Germany, is that we will have a cooperative peace order together with Russia. This is over. Jana has already touched upon it. I mean, there will be a security order against Russia, not because we want it, but because Russia has left this joint order deliberately. But this does not mean, and this is equally important, that we now start with some kind of war mantra. I think the biggest challenge for us will be that the new order, which is yet to emerge, will be an order based on conflicts, however, below the threshold of a war. I mean, Ukraine was not in a state of peace since 2014. It was in a permanent state of a conflict, or put the other way around, Russia imposed a conflict on Ukraine since 2014 with permanent battles and at the conflicting line. And this is one image of the new order that is about to emerge. How do we deal with a conflict below the threshold of a war, which is lingering on, especially if it's a conflict, and Lars Klingbeil has also mentioned it, which is not merely a military conflict. This would be too easy, but via cyber attacks against the Bundestag, via undermining the society through fake news. And Russia Today, for example, is not a media outlet. It's a weapon of a war. It's a war weapon. So how do we deal with the idea of a permanent conflict? And what kind of role will the EU and NATO play? And how do we as Europe be sovereign in this conflict setting? So sovereignty. To come back, second aspect, first of all, I think we need a change in mentality. In order to come from a peace order where we thought we can do everything together to a order of conflict where we we need a new mindset. So this means that the geoeconomic intentions and our comfort zone, we have to come to a geostrategic zone or geostrategic setting. And this is what we are doing already. This process has become highly political. The question is whether Georgia will be given a perspective whether Ukraine becomes a candidate is a highly political issue. If not, we would not debate it. So we are already getting out of this comfort zone, especially for us in Germany when it comes to defense questions. This is uncomfortable. And we have not yet talked about nuclear deterrence. One of the reasons why this war has not yet reached NATO territory is the functioning nuclear deterrence. And this brings me to the aspect of solidarity. European sovereignty, strategy, capability to act. Basically, the question is, can the EU define its own positions? Can the EU implement, assert its own positions alone or together with partners? And if we are honest about it, the EU cannot. And we have debating it for ages. So do we always need a crisis first in order to make progress? Was the 2014 crisis not big enough? Of course, our Eastern European neighbors would say, we have told you, at least since 2008, but you wouldn't listen. So my question now is, do we get enough energy out of this crisis in order to achieve a Zeitenwende? And it's very important how we implement it in Germany. When we manage with these 100 billion or 2% of our gross domestic product to realign our defense policy, we will also be able to manage the Zeitenwende at the European level. So the successful German Zeitenwende is a precondition for a successful European Zeitenwende. Can we reform the armed forces? Can we spend this fund wisely? Can we spend our funds together? I put huge question marks behind it, maybe because I have been in the business for such a long time, but I'm pleased to be convinced from the opposite.
Thanks a lot. I also have a lot of question marks, but I'd like to ask the Minister. You were talking about the hot chamber here next door, the Ministry of Defense. So what is the exact link between the 100 billion of the special fund and the European Union? So this hot chamber here in Germany, how we push for the Zeitenwende to make sure we can defend ourselves in the alliance, deterrence, how can we give an impulse to our European partners? So right now, our allies in Eastern Europe, they empty their shelves, all the old equipment goes away. So isn't that a moment where we can seize the opportunity and advance with this 100 billion? Yes, this speech of the Zeitenwende, and Katarina Barley has mentioned it, it was really a moment of relief, and I felt it when I was sitting with my colleagues, the other defense ministers in Europe, because we all felt, yes, in Germany, although it's a very tricky discussion here, also up to the speech, how do we deal with this war? But yes, here in Germany also we're moving ahead. We're reaching far-reaching decisions. Let's be honest, until the 24th of February, 70% of the population supported the idea of not delivering weapons to zones of crisis, regions of war. And 70% of the population supported that decision. It wasn't taken by this government, but previous governments had taken that decision until the 24th of February. And then we were faced with this brutal war of aggression. And then quickly we felt in politics, but also in society, that through this shift, we're not going to stay at that. It's a principle that is fundamentally right, yes, but in this concrete case, where we have a war here in Europe at the borders of the NATO territory, we have to change something. And then quickly, we felt that within society, but also in policy making, these attitudes changed. When the government said, yes, we will now deploy and deliver weapons to Ukraine, 70% of the population again agreed with that position. And I think that is quite significant, how fast public opinion changed and supported our political decisions. So now we have this huge opportunity as Germany to advance. I'm not so sure we necessarily need this leadership role. But what's important to me is that we can give incentives for doing more jointly, especially in this very difficult international procurement business. It's very important that not everybody does their own national solo run. We need some joint criteria, where we want to go, what system could be the best. And I don't want leadership to mean we define things, but we just create the incentives and develop something jointly with our EU partners and NATO partners. I think this is a very tricky and emotional affair when it's about armament projects, because it's very much about economic interests of individual companies and thus national governments. But now we do have the opportunity from this niche where we used to be in to exit this niche and take up this very important, relevant task of investing jointly. I talked with my French colleague. She's not in office anymore now, but right at the beginning of my term of office, we were talking about a project of joint cooperation to work on the successor of the tornado. And it got very clear that there were a lot of concerns and emotions. Who gets access to information about such an armament project? Who doesn't have access? How do I implement it? These are all very delicate matters. But now we can seize the opportunity, and this is what I want to say. You know, we as Germans, we can show how we can organize it. We can give an incentive. We need to change things in Germany ourselves, and we've already started doing so. 20% of our procurement orders that are placed are not done via a very tricky, bureaucratic administrative procedure. And we changed that 9 weeks ago. We could have done that long ago, actually, but 20% is now out of the tricky bureaucratic procedure. And yes, I know that the politicians, the European politicians, well, they're not going to like it that much, but we might deviate as well from the European procurement procedure here in Germany. We haven't done that so far, but now we're at times where this is very urgent, where it's necessary. And we also need to make sure that our procurement serves the interest of national defense. So it's not always going to be an easy path, but if we do not embark on it now, I do not see when we could do that and when it would be appropriate. And by this, we also create standards, set standards, and have a leading role with regards to other countries. They can see how do we proceed when it comes to armament projects. With the decisions that we've taken, we have come up with a list of investments, and some representatives from the armament industry was very surprised because we did not ask them, what do you have, what could you supply, so that we can spend this 100 billion? No, we defined what are the challenges that we need to meet in future at the military level, and what procurement do we need in order to meet these challenges. So I think that was a very different approach. We didn't ask for supply lists of the armament industry, but I think that's the right path. And I think other nations are looking at us, and this is what leadership means for me, to embark on new paths, to dare something new. Thanks so much. Before I also ask some questions from the audience, two more questions, maybe to Jana Puglierin. Last Klingbeil was talking about us having to assume our responsibility, do our homework, and what I hear now from the Ministry of Defense, it sounds alike. And I think the South will be happy to hear that, Germany doing its homework, the South of Europe. But the other thing is, you were talking about particular economic interests, national interests, emotional, delicate issues, and this is what's retained us in the back. Claudia Major spoke about the moment of the crisis, the moment of the Zeitenwende, where we need to step ahead to move forward, define our own positions, create capacities, and go beyond national or economic particular interests. Can that work out, and what are the opportunities? You have 3 minutes. Yes, I think it can work. Who can do it if it's not us, and when if not now? So this should be our guiding principle. What the minister said on the EU-NATO cooperation, I thought it was very important, especially for us here in Germany, because we always think, how can we strengthen European defense? And we always do it in this kind of checking the box kind of thinking this is what can be done in NATO and this is what can be done in the EU. I think we have to look at this in a much more comprehensive way. How can these institutions be complementary? But how do we have an overall approach with other partners? The French government does a lot in very flexible formats. We don't like to do that because we want to do it within the European framework, want to strengthen the EU, but still we need to have a stance on that. And I think we need to have an approach of all hands on deck and have to move beyond compartmentalized thinking. I think we need to be aware what the danger and risk is right now with all this money and the Zeitenwende. It's not just our Zeitenwende, our turn of the era. It's a European Zeitenwende. There's 40% more of budgeting in all the European budgets compared to what was assumed before the war, 2021. There's a lot of pressure to spend this money. And of course, there are some positive signs. We can invest it into existing multinational corporations, projects. For example, the project with the French corporation that didn't have enough financing. But there are also some problems. If we, as Germans, import a lot, purchase a lot from Israel, the US, from other countries, because it's already there, because it's working, because it's effective, then obviously that's money that we do not invest into European cooperation. So I think we need to find a good balance and also find a way of suppressing the national interest, the particular interests of every country. I think after the financial crisis, we had a similar effect. Every country engaged in cuts, but there was no coordination. Christina Miller was talking about the bonsai armies back in those days. I think that was an appropriate image. And I think now we shouldn't grow wildly and just grow up and up without any coordination. And I think we in Germany, we've always been advocating European armament cooperation. I think we can really create a good emphasis. Johanna Tompot, I would like to ask you to read out some of the questions from the off. Thanks a lot, Christoph Katsioulis. I'd like to give you one question into the discussion. The question is, Zeitenwende cannot happen without a change of the geopolitical order and the goals of China. We have to reconsider this. Why does Germany not reconsider its approach towards China in order to avoid a new shock when China will aggress Taiwan? So, okay, you have very few minutes to answer these questions. Well, now we're in this very comfortable position because we also have the final panel, which will talk about starting a new world order. And I think we'll also address these questions. But nevertheless, I'd like to ask the panelists to answer this question about China, but also a next question. Lars was talking about very many concrete ideas that are already on the table, but a lack of political willingness to implement them. And now there is willingness because of two reasons: the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but the second reason, and I think the guests from the US were agreeing, that there's going to be an election in 2024 in the US, and we might be faced with the threat of a second Trump administration. So that would again change the security world order. So how do we deal with this very concrete challenges, the one that is on our hands right now, but also on the longer run? Claudia Major, the floor is yours. China. All right, I'll be brief because we have another panel on that issue. Lars Klingenberg already mentioned it. We need to draw lessons from the conflict with Russia with regards to China, and we have to reduce one-sided dependencies. We need to diversify. We shouldn't depend just on one state, but on several to have more room for maneuver, find alternative suppliers, alternative markets. Our key industries need to be protected. So the question is, how much do we learn right now? Shouldn't we increase our learning curve when we look at China? Not much more now, because there's going to be another panel on that. When it comes to the US, in the area of defense, we have to be very honest with ourselves. Even if we as Europeans just limit ourselves to the classical, traditional realm of defense, if we as Europeans want to fill a potential gap of the US, then we talk about 10, 15, 20 years. We can think about the role that the US has in European defense. It's a role of political leadership. It creates unity, because none of the big European countries, the British, the French, nor us, We do not have this uncontested role of leadership. So the question is, how could we replace a role of political leadership? And the second element is the US delivers conventional capacities in many areas, more than 50%, especially when it comes to heavy weaponry. Even if we really sit ourselves down and do spend this money intelligently, jointly. Nevertheless, it'll take a long while. You talked about the future combat air system, the German, French, Spanish cooperation. It's not an aircraft, it's much more. It's a system with drones and everything. In 2017, this program was launched, and the plan was for it to become operational in 2040. But I think it's only going to happen in 2045. That's not the day after tomorrow. If we as Europeans actually seriously try to fill in these gaps with capacities from tanks to complex systems, we talk about 10 to 15 years. Third area, nuclear deterrence. We are under this nuclear deterrence umbrella of the US. So we're relying on nuclear participation, the US nuclear forces, and the French and the British capacities. If we want to change this, it's going to be more instability for us, but also for Russia. In addition, there's also some soft aspects, the ears and eyes incorporation, the enablers, as we could say. This task that we as Europe should shape our own security is very necessary. I think this should be our ambition. With the EU, we have created something that's remarkable, and we're not able to defend it ourselves. That, we should be a bit shameful of that. So it's very urgent, but let's be honest, it's not going to be done in 5 years. 2 further points, very small, very shortly. Zeitenwende means leadership, a leadership role in the questions that hurt, that are painful, and where our partners have a huge question mark. Russia, we already said it, Jana said it, and defense. And these are really crucial matters like arms delivery, armament, weaponry delivery. We're doing things that was inconceivable in Germany until shortly, but when we compare it to our economic and political weight, it's not enough. We're just in a medium range, but we aren't at the top level in other areas. So I think there is a huge gap. Credibility in an existential crisis, and for our partners in Middle, Central and Eastern Europe, it is an existential crisis. It is about credibility. What we do now is not only our credibility in this concrete area of defense, it's credibility in all European matters. And this is why it's so essential. And, to use this Zeitenwende, and I do like the term leadership role, in this very uncomfortable area of defense and weaponry and delivery, we need to shape this area. Thanks a lot, Claudia. Major. Katarina, what can we do next, the next steps? Not only 10, 15 years, but also the capacity to take decisions in the EU. Yes, I wanted to approach that from another way, not outside in, but inside out. Because I'm a bit disturbed, and not only since the war started, that we only start asking ourselves fundamental questions when we're in a severe crisis. We already mentioned the financial crisis, but it was also about regulation of financial sectors, then the pandemic. Then we were thinking about, let's exchange more information and joint procurement, but now we're in another crisis. I don't even want to mention the migration crisis, climate. We all agree that we have to tackle this jointly. It's not possible otherwise. But this constant mode of we have an acute problem and then we panic, what do? That doesn't mean we're going to find the best solution when I look back to the financial crisis, for example. No, I think finally we have to change this system round. We have to ask ourselves, what is Europe supposed to be doing? What are we supposed to achieve? And what are the member states supposed to achieve? These questions that we're talking about, and Claudia Moore mentioned is, we haven't been talking about them since yesterday. No, joint procurement, how many party programs have listed that already? That's a very old idea, and it's normal. I don't think we need to set any incentives, financial incentives, because obviously it's already going to be much less expensive to purchase jointly. But we wouldn't have had to deliver all these weapons to Ukraine if we already had compatible weapon systems among all the member states. So what we need is a serious effort to rethink the linkage between member states and the European Union. What's their relationship? We had an attempt with this conference about the future of Europe, but what was the approach? The Parliament thought it was great. The Commission was a bit like, all right, if necessary, if it has to be. And the Council did everything in its power to water it down. And now the same is happening when it comes to the implementation of the 49 measures that the citizens and the politicians and NGOs agreed on. And these measures they make a lot of sense. They would make us advance. And, it's we've mentioned them: strengthening the parliament, abolishing unanimity, strengthening the social pillar. But there is a lot of reticence with the member states, some form of reflex. They do not want to touch on these delicate matters. And if you want to build a Europe viable for the future with a corresponding foreign and security policy, then we need to engage in these delicate matters. Jana, if we talk about what the European Union should focus on, Lars Klingbeil has already sketched out this world with these centers, attractive centers. Would that be a goal that the member states could agree on, that we could work towards? Is that a vision for the future? You have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Is it working? Okay. Well, I have to use 1 minute for a remark on the US, because there's also some positive news from the US. Yes, we need them, we're dependent on them, but the Biden administration has been very constructive in working together with us Europeans, and I think that's a history of success. We do not know what's going to happen in 2024, but this crisis has shown that the US needs Europe, because security is not only defense. With Russia, it's also about sanctions. And the European Union has really supported the American approach in sanctions. So I think it was an experience in this crisis where both sides of the transatlantic partnership got the impression that they're better off together than alone. And I hope that in the US also, on the Republican side of things, it will create some form of increased consciousness. So this idea of us being an attractive international center, this idea is already on the table. Klaus Klingbeil said we already have exchanged on this idea, the capacity to act, sovereignty, or whatever it may be. But this idea that the EU is a player, not a plaything at the international level, that we're able to assert our values, our interests at the international level, that we can shape our environment. We do have ambitions in environmental policy, health policy. The EU has been very committed in this. I think this idea is already on the table, and we need to fill it with political willingness and with life. Thank you so much. So all the others here on the panel are part of the legislative, but you, Minister, you're part of the executive. What is going to happen in this cooperation with neighboring countries? What will change now? So we will change our procurement system. We will talk to our partners and make sure they're interoperational. This is very important to me. And, maybe I was joking a bit when I described it before. But I'm really despaired if I hear that air control systems aren't aligned, if we cannot communicate one another. It's a very detailed level, but it's very important. So we have to make sure that we're able to think things jointly, to make sure that not every state purchases their weaponry individually, but we need these rounds of coordination and really discuss how do we create an allied army. No state can do that by itself. We need to have this thinking in alliances when it comes to planning and procurement. One more remark when it comes to the US. It's very important to me. When the decision was taken about the special fund, 100 billion, I went to the US and I also talked to Republican members of parliament. And what I experienced gives cause for optimism, no matter what the election is going to be, to end in 2024, because these Republican members of parliament, they actually understood this decision. They said, well, finally, the Germans, the Europeans, they do commit to NATO. They do take it seriously. And it's not us only, the US, who always give money, because this was their sentiment, that the Republicans, they always thought it was them financing everything, but they got the impression that finally we, the Europeans, we take up our responsibility. And I think that's strengthening NATO, and this is why I'm optimistic that NATO will not be questioned as it was before during the Trump administration. Thanks a lot. That's it. Thank you so much to the panelists. It was great up here.
Und ich würde gern mit dem wahrscheinlich einzigen
I would like to end with a metaphor from soccer. Claudia Major said we're in the middle range, but those who are into football know that we steer the match from the middle range, and so this maybe is our vision from a future steering from the medium range. Thank you so much.